Hello, this is Rabbi Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Devarim. It is the first Torah portion in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy. And so you might expect this Shabbat to be named Shabbat Devarim, because generally the name of a Shabbat is derived from that week's Torah portion. We read from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, every Shabbat morning on an annual cycle. And so the Shabbat on which we read the first portion in Genesis, the portion of Bereshit, is traditionally known as Shabbat Bereshit. The following week, when we read the Torah portion known as Noach, that Shabbat is traditionally known as Shabbat Noach. And so you might expect this coming Shabbat to be known as Shabbat Devarim, the Shabbat of Devarim, the Shabbat on which we begin the reading of Deuteronomy. And yet this Shabbat is not generally known as Shabbat Devarim, but rather Shabbat Chazon. Shabbat Chazon, which literally means the Shabbat of prophecy. But where does this strange name come from? It comes not from this week's Torah portion, it comes from this week's Haftarah. You see, in addition to reading a portion from the Torah every Shabbat morning, we also chant a passage from prophetic literature every Shabbat morning, and that passage is known as the Haftarah. The Haftarah that accompanies the portion of Devarim begins with the phrase, Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz, the prophecies of Isaiah, the son of Amoz. This is the beginning of the book of Isaiah. And so this Shabbat gets its name from the first word of the Haftarah, not from one of the first words of the Torah portion, Shabbat Chazon. And so the Haftarah begins as all Haftarot do, with a familiar Haftarah chant. Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz, Asher Chaza al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, Bimei Uziyahu Yotam, Achaz Yechizkiyahu Malchei Yehuda. Standard Haftarah melody. But then the melody changes in the second verse of the Haftarah. Shim'u shamayim v'hazini eretz ki Adonai diber banim gidalti v'romamti v'hem pasha'u vi. The majority of the Haftarah, most of the verses of the Haftarah, are chanted to this unique, mournful chant that we associate with a holiday coming up. We chant this Haftarah largely to the same mournful melody with which we chant the biblical book known as Eicha, known in English as Lamentations. And the mournful chanting of the Book of Lamentations is one of the central rituals of the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, which is the next significant holiday coming in the Jewish calendar. If the mournful melody of the Haftarah caught your attention, the words themselves are equally striking. For example, here's Isaiah chapter 1, verse 4, just a few verses into the Haftarah. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children, they have forsaken the Lord, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs on God. And a few verses later, hear the words of the Lord, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to our God's instruction, you folks of Gomorrah. My goodness, the Jews are here referred to as the people of Sodom and Amorah, the people of the two most notorious cities in the Torah. cities that were so evil that they deserved utter destruction. And here, through the words of the prophet Isaiah, God castigates the Jews, calling them the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. But wait, it gets worse. What need have I of all your sacrifices, says the Lord? I am sated with burnt offerings of rams and suet of fatlings and blood of bulls. I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. That you come to appear before me? Who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath, proclaiming of solemnities, assemblies with iniquity, I cannot abide. You see, God is not saying here, I don't want your sacrifices. This is the same God who mandated the sacrifices in the Torah. God is not saying, I don't want you to observe Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, our major holidays, and even our minor holidays. God is not saying that, but in a sense, God is suggesting through prophetic hyperbole, through prophetic exaggeration, that sacrifices offered by corrupt people are an affront to God. Observance of Shabbat and holidays by people who are morally degenerate is an offense to God. And so what we see in this week's Haftarah is the prophet in castigating mode, or to put it another way, God in God's most angry mode in prophetic literature. This week's Haftarah is one of the most angry, judgmental Haftarot. But as a matter of fact, it is the seventh of 7 angry, castigating Haftarot that we read in this 7-week period leading up to Tisha B'Av. So every Shabbat for 7 weeks leading up to this mournful holiday, the 9th of Av, we hear yet another angry, judgmental proclamation from one of God's prophets. The question is, why do we have these 7 special Haftarot in the 7-week period leading up to Tisha B'Av, which after all is a minor holiday? I mean, in the scheme of things, Tisha B'Av is not Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av is not Shabbat, Tisha B'Av is not Pesach. Tisha B'Av is a relatively minor holiday. But minor does not mean unimportant. And even this relatively minor holiday has some important lessons to teach us. Let me begin with a joke that's been circulating around the internet for quite a few years. It's an internet joke about the Jewish holidays. And it purports to explain the significance of each of the Jewish holidays. Here's the joke. Pesach, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Purim, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Hanukkah, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Tisha B'Av, they tried to kill us, they won, now we fast. The joke is slightly amusing and perhaps slightly offensive as well for a number of reasons. It, I think, diminishes the deep, rich, multifaceted significance of our holidays. But more, it suggests that most of our holidays, even our happy holidays, are really about our enemies. Fortunately, in most cases, our triumphs over our enemies. But it also feeds the unfortunate stereotype that Jewishness, that our Jewish identities, or perhaps Judaism itself, are essentially about negativity, about winding our way through history, about kvetching our way through our own lives. And who needs a Jewish identity like that, some might wonder? Who needs a Jewish tradition like that? Of course, Jewish history, and especially Jewish history as commemorated throughout our holiday year, are not primarily about negativity. We celebrate much more than we mourn, historically speaking. But in a way, that begs the question. If our celebratory holidays seem largely to commemorate our triumph over our enemies, then do we fall into the trap of an us against the world kind of Jewish identity? You know, there's a section of the Haggadah, the book that we use to conduct the Seder on the first 2 evenings of Pesach. There's a section in the Haggadah that a lot of Jews tend to skip. I don't mean Jews who, once dinner has passed and the hour has grown late, are skipping passages and pages like mad. I mean traditionalist Jews who might skip very little else at the Seder. But many of them skip one particular passage quite deliberately. It's at the time when we fill Elijah's cup and open the door to welcome Elijah the prophet, the biblical hero who will return to earth one day to announce the coming of the Messiah. We pause during our celebration of the redemption of the past to evoke our hope for the redemption of the future. And here's the passage that many people skip. It includes a few verses from Psalms and from Lamentations. Shvo chamadcha el hagoyim asher lo yuda'ucha v'al mamlachot asher b'shimcha lo kara'u. Pour out your wrath on the nations that have not known you, and on the kingdoms that have not called upon your name. For they have devoured Jacob and laid waste his dwelling place. Pour out your wrath on them. May your blazing anger overtake them. Pursue them in wrath and destroy them from under the heavens of the Lord. Pretty strong language, huh? You can understand why at least some contemporary Jews find these passages off-putting. After all, we live in 21st century America, and we don't view our neighbors as our enemies by and large. Why should we indulge ourselves in vitriolic pronouncements about them when we don't and shouldn't view them in such negative ways? The point, though, is that although we do live in 21st century America, we don't live only in the here and now. Franz Rosenzweig, an early 20th century German Jewish philosopher, taught that the Jews are a meta-historical people. A meta-historical people who do not live simply in the here and now. Rather, we are regularly transported to other times and places to vicariously re-experience those significant historical moments. So, for example, on Pesach, if we're doing it right, we're with our fellow ancient Israelites, experiencing the suffering of enslavement, the struggle for freedom, and the miraculous triumph of liberation. But we're not only in ancient Egypt during the Seder, we're also in that cave in Bnei Brak with Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, planning the Bar Kokhba revolt, the hopeless and yet hopeful revolt against Roman oppressors. When we open the door and stand for Elijah, we're also standing with generations of Jews who continued to live under the thumb of Rome, hoping for the day when God would vanquish our brutal oppressors. And maybe we're also standing with generations of ghettoized Jews who lived surrounded by hostile neighbors, who knew that Pesach season was also pogrom season, and who needed to defiantly shake their fists, even if inside their houses, at their oppressors and their oppression. And so on Tisha B'Av, we're with our ancestors almost 2,600 years ago, looking at the temple in ruins, being dragged off to exile in Babylonia, wondering if God has abandoned us, wondering if we are ever going to survive this devastating experience. Jewish anger, Jewish defiance in the face of oppression are also part of our historical experience, no less and no less important than Jewish pride and Jewish rejoicing. There is a bracha, a blessing in the daily Amidah, in the central silent prayer, which is the main prayer of each of our daily services. And there's a bracha in the Amidah that troubles some contemporary Jews as well. To the talebearers, may there be no hope. May all the evil ones instantly disappear. May all of your enemies be quickly cut down, and may you quickly uproot, crush, subdue, and humble the arrogant speedily and in our days. For a long time, quite a few years ago, I would skip that bracha entirely during my weekday davening. After all, I told myself, I don't harbor ill will toward all those around me. The bracha struck me as expressive of a long-standing Jewish hostility toward all non-Jews, and I rejected this anti-Goyim prejudice. Not all of our neighbors are our enemies, I told myself. One day, probably 40 or more years ago, I was discussing this bracha and my dilemma about this bracha with a rabbinical school classmate. And I said to him, I don't like to recite this bracha because we're not surrounded by enemies anymore. We don't have enemies today? My friend asked. You never heard of Ayatollah Khomeini? I came to realize, as a result of this conversation and further thought, that this bracha is important. For one thing, it brings to mind countless Sonei Yisrael, countless enemies of Israel, enemies of the Jews, who have risen in every generation. So Tisha B'Av is not only about the Babylonians and the Romans and what they did to us so many centuries ago. Many tragedies are associated with Tisha B'Av, 5 of which are enumerated in the Talmud. God's decision that the Israelites who left Egypt, the generation of the desert, would not enter the promised land, the destruction of the first and second temples, first by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and then by the Romans in 70 CE, the conquest of Beitar, the Jews' stronghold during the Bar Kokhba revolt, and finally, the plowing up of Jerusalem by the Romans. After the Romans destroyed the second temple in Jerusalem, they destroyed the beautiful capital city as well. And so according to the Talmud, those 5 tragedies occurred on Tisha B'Av. But there are many other tragedies that since Talmudic times have also become associated with Tisha B'Av. Now, I don't know if the First Crusade in 1095, the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, the beginning of World War I in 1914, the deportations of the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka in 1942. I don't know that all of those tragic events all began on the 9th of Av in each of those respective years. The factual historicity of those claims is not so important. Tisha B'Av is the day that's associated with these tragedies and so many others. Tisha B'Av is the day on which we pause to mourn these tragedies. Tisha B'Av is the day on which we try to learn lessons from those tragedies. And of course, we need not go back to 13th century England or 15th century Spain or 20th century Poland to learn these lessons. Anti-Semitism is not simply a vestige of our long, distant past. We need to go back less than 2 years to remember the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, to remember that massacring Jews by anti-Semites is a feature of the modern world as well. And these angry, castigating haftarot, of which this week's haftarah is the 7th, are among the ways in which we prepare ourselves for Tisha B'Av, with increasing anxiety, with increasing mournfulness, we approach the day which is associated with countless Jewish tragedies. The Talmud tells us, "V'chol hametzaer atzmo im hatzibur," everyone who makes himself or herself suffer with the community, zoche v'ro'eh benechamat tzibur, will one day merit seeing the consolation of the community. This is not simply strategic advice. It's not merely our obligation to be diligent on behalf of beleaguered Jews. It's also an existential imperative. What gives me the right to celebrate on Pesach? What gives me the right to celebrate on Hanukkah? What gives me the right to celebrate on Yom HaAtzmaut? Among other things, my mourning on Tisha B'Av gives me that right. It's my sharing the painful parts of my Jewish historical consciousness that permits me to share in its joyous aspects as well. Tisha B'Av is our opportunity, indeed our challenge, to mourn along with our brothers and sisters who have mourned long ago and not so long ago and even today. It's our opportunity to express our anguish, our anger, our despair. It's our opportunity also to learn and relearn the lessons of our tragic experience. In the days to come, you will have an opportunity to view numerous videos which are soon to be produced by Hebrew Home staff, explaining different aspects of Tisha B'Av and different lessons from Tisha B'Av. This Shabbat, as we hear or think about the Haftarah of Shabbat Chazon, that will aid us in our preparation for our observance of Tisha B'Av and learning its many lessons. Shabbat Shalom.